Chapter 2. I can't believe your mother-in-law said that, Natasha said, in shock as Geeta narrated what had occurred on her birthday the previous day. Geeta nodded as her friends sat and ate the cake she had brought them. She felt a close connection with the housewives of Sapphire Towers and met them every day in the lawns, where the children played and they sat and gossiped. The three towers were connected through a common lobby and the walking track that went around it. They were also connected through refuge floors that were to be used in case of a fire. It was a large hall that connected each tower. There were 24 floors on each tower, with penthouses on the two top floors of all three towers. The residents of those flats were rarely seen in the lawns. Their drivers opened the doors of their Audis and BMWs when the people entered and exited the building from the lobby area. The rest had parking on the 3 floors below the building, where the drivers sat and gossiped. There were common area bathrooms for workers in all the parking floors and a canteen on one side where one could get hot samosas and milky chai. There were shops outside Sapphire Towers that the residents used, a dry cleaners, a tiny tot school, an ice cream parlor, 2 grocery stores, several vegetable vendors, and a hardware store. Although Geeta and her friends hardly walked on the track, they met around 6 every evening for 2 hours to chat about their lives. This evening, Geeta, Natasha, and Sarita were together. Aarti had said she would be a bit late. No 4 women could be as different as them. Geeta was petite with slim hips, mid-length dark brown hair, and tiny breasts that she hated. Natasha was tall and slender with a toned, bronzed body and a full pout. Sarita was of average height with wide hips and heavy breasts that she was quite proud of. Despite their physical differences, their mental connection was very strong. Geeta saw the cake vanish in seconds when she brought it down in a plastic box for her friends. It was the first time that she hadn't made the cake at home herself. She didn't want to do any work on her own birthday and splurged a little on a 1-kilo dark chocolate cake for herself. She didn't even finish the piece of cake I gave her before she took another one, Geeta continued. Of course, Shailesh didn't see because he came home much later. She told him she had been so good and not had anything. She's unbelievable. Geeta was selective in revealing the juicy details of her private life. She conveniently decided not to tell them about Sahil's visit or the fact that she had had lunch with him in the afternoon. My husband would have told his mother not to lie. He's always taken my side, said Natasha. Geeta looked at her incredulously. Natasha was a forthright woman. It seemed as if her marriage was perfect. She always boasted about how her husband took her to overseas trips and how she managed to balance her home and life perfectly. It probably also had to do with having only one daughter who was all grown up and didn't need her mother. You won't understand family politics, Natasha, said Sarita. It's very complicated to speak in front of your in-laws. One must keep the harmony at home as well. Sarita lived with her in-laws as well, in a 3-bedroom flat in another wing. Her grown-up children stayed in one room and her in-laws in another, while she enjoyed marital bliss with her husband in a separate room. She had often felt lucky that they had booked the 3-bedroom place when the towers were being built, even though her in-laws had complained about spending so much money. But space created peace, and they all seemed like a happy, content family today. Hi guys, what have I missed? Said Aarti as she joined them. Aarti, it's so good to see you after 4 days, said Geeta, giving her a warm hug. Aarti was the quintessential beauty amongst them. With a porcelain face and chestnut brown hair, she could easily have given any of the Bollywood heroines a run for their money. Even though she was slightly on the plump side, Aarti never shied away from her sexuality and wore dresses and skirts, something that no other housewife did in Sapphire Towers. This new sales role is so tough, she said. Aarti had always been with sales in a corporate job, and with the passing of time, her travels had increased. She was very tempted to resign and stay at home after the birth of her child Aryan, but her in-laws had insisted she keep her job while they looked after him. She was very grateful to them. They found purpose to their lives by looking after Aryan, and she found meaning to hers by working. Her friends envied her dedication to her career. Secretly, they wondered if the ambition would eventually wear off and she would decide to settle down to look after her husband and child. But she surprised them by climbing up the corporate ladder and earning pots of money for the family. Natasha filled her in on their in-law bashing conversation. As they expected, Aarti didn't join in the fray. Rather, she said, "I'm sorry to hear that, Geeta. But not all in-laws are like that. Look at mine. They let me do what I want. In fact, they're the best thing that happened to me after Aryan." "Let's drop all this bashing," she continued. "I have some big news." They all kept their eyes on her. Aarti was known to be dramatic. She liked having an audience. "The clubhouse is hosting Zumba classes for women, and it's only $500 a month. We can all join." She clasped her hands and was extremely pleased with her news. The women looked at her skeptically. "I don't know, Aarti," said Geeta, biting her lip. "I'll have to ask Shailesh. I mean, he might not like it if I'm jumping around in front of other people." The mere thought of discussing it with Shailesh tired her. She knew it would be pointless. She'd get his endless whys and hows before finally winning, and she would be left exhausted in trying to make her point. Sarita agreed with Geeta. "I'll have to ask for money from the house, and it just puts me in an awkward state. So I don't know, Aarti." She knew her in-laws were supremely rich. They had crores to invest in properties all over Mumbai. But for small things within the house, they were tight-fisted. She didn't want to lose the peace in the house by asking for money and time away from her duties. Aarti couldn't believe her friends. Weren't they modern women? Goodness! They were educated and literate one day, and yet they behaved as if they were being held on puppet strings by the men in their life. Aarti looked towards Natasha, who hadn't said a word. But Natasha just said, "Why do we need to exercise so much? We're married. It hardly matters if we put on some weight." Aarti was incredulous. "It's not about weight. It's about being fit and healthy for ourselves." "You can afford to do all this, Aarti," said Sarita. "You have a job and you're earning, and you're in the glam industry where you need to be thin. It's too difficult for us to take out time to do all this." "What glam, Sarita? Sales is hardly glam," Aarti said with a snort that Geeta thought only she noticed. Maybe Aarti was getting tired of her job and needed to do something more? Geeta said, "At least you get to travel to new places and meet new people." "Look at me," Geeta wanted to add. She had gone from her parents' home to that of her in-laws, and she had never seen any part of India, as Shailesh hated traveling, especially with the children. Aarti replied, "Yes, there's travel, but it's tiring as well. No job is easy, even if you love it passionately." "Hey, tell them about the time you traveled with Kareena Kapoor." Sarita suddenly remembered that story. The glam factor was there, for sure. They then found themselves talking about show business, and from there, they moved on to the latest movies. Soon the Zumba class was forgotten, and everyone was discussing if their husbands had taken them to the theatre recently. Sarita and her husband were movie buffs who watched the latest film every Friday evening. It was their date night, she said, and they always had fun. It was also the one thing that he would splurge on because he enjoyed films. Otherwise, he opened his wallet very rarely too. Natasha said that she watched all her movies on pirated DVDs since she hated going to a movie hall alone, with Vikram, her husband, constantly traveling. Geeta secretly wished to watch films but rarely got the chance, unless it was coming on cable TV late night and could watch once everyone had gone to sleep. Sometimes she thought she needed to see them just to prove to everyone she did watch films. Otherwise, they would consider her boring. Aarti, meanwhile, was not fond of Hindi movies, which was fine, given how she rarely had time off work to go to a movie hall. Her family had an active social life, and whenever she was in town, she had to accompany them to parties. "You're lucky, yaar," Geeta told Aarti. "At least you get to attend parties." "It's not that fun anymore," Aarti said. "All I want to do is sleep when I get back. But as a wife, I need to be there for my husband and in-laws as well." "And your child," reminded Natasha. Aarti nodded. "Yes, Aryan is 7 years old and needs me." That's all the cue they needed, as the girlfriends then talked about their children and how they needed their mothers, whatever age they were. Natasha kept quiet. She'd always felt that her daughter Dia was an independent child and did not need her as much as other children her age needed their parents. Now a teenager, Dia wanted to do everything her peers at the international school were doing, and Natasha had a hard time disciplining her. It was something that troubled her deeply. It would also lead to a great rift between them in the near future. Before the group knew it, it was 8 o'clock, and they had to rush back home. "What have you cooked today, Geeta?" asked Aarti. "Something simple. Veg pulao, sabudana vada, papad and bundi raita. I wasn't in the mood to cook so much." Geeta smiled. She was aware that among all of them, she had the best culinary skills. She was quite proud of that fact. "Wow, Geeta," said Sarita. "That's simple. That's awesome. I've made aloo parathas." Sarita had been forced to learn how to cook when she got married. It was a chore that she grudgingly did every day just to please her in-laws. "It's easy," Geeta said. "I have a maid who chops up the vegetables. I just throw things in then." "I wish my in-laws would keep a maid," Sarita said. "With great difficulty, I forced them to keep a top servant to clean the entire house and come twice a day to do dishes." Sarita suddenly recalled the early days of her marriage, when she did all the housework on her own, and then at night was also expected to pleasure her husband, Jay. It was a tough 6 months. Her in-laws didn't like the fact that she found housework to be a burden, and her husband resented it when she denied him sex on nights when she was simply too tired. Natasha chimed in. "I've made a salad, and Vikram and Diya had better eat that tonight with leftovers from yesterday. I was in no mood to cook." Natasha glanced at her phone to check if Vikram had called to even say when he would be back home. But there was no message from him. She was glad he hadn't reached home yet. If he had, and she wasn't there, he would be extremely upset. She shuddered at the thought of what he would have done next. She looked up and smiled at them, not betraying any emotion. There were some secrets that could never come out of the closet. "Rahul would love your salad, I bet," Sarita said. "That boy, he's obsessed with the gym and eating healthy. And he's only 18, for God's sake. Seems like yesterday I was giving him smileys for tiffin." "This is why I pay a maid to cook, guys," Aarti said. "I make sure I contribute to the family income so I don't have to do any domestic shit." Sarita and Geeta threw each other a knowing glance. This was the nth time that Aarti had thrown the fact that she was a working woman, the only one amongst them. It was tiring. They felt like she was looking down on them for being housewives, though she never meant it in that manner. Geeta said gently, "There's no shame in cooking for your family, Aarti. You know what they say, the way to a man's heart is through his stomach. It gives me great pride to know they rely on me for something. And the fact that they love my food makes me quite happy." Aarti seemed to have realized the crudeness of her words. "Oh, I didn't mean it like that, Geeta. I only meant that I'm so bad at it that thankfully I can hire a cook. Otherwise I would burn everything in the kitchen." They all laughed. Geeta said to Aarti, "We're all good at some things and horrible at others. How does it matter if you can't cook? You're excellent at pampering your pati and Aryan." She gave Aarti a warm hug. Somehow, no matter how close the women were, they rarely took each other's husbands' names, choosing to call them your husband or your pati and keep a safe distance, thereby acknowledging respect for each other. Aarti, trying to make up for her faux pas, replied, "But I would seriously like to learn. I don't even know what to throw in if the maid chops up things." "Maybe we can take a cooking class together?" asked Natasha. "My maid takes so many days off that I feel like I'm helping her instead of the other way around." They all burst out laughing. The 4 pillars of conversation you could have with any housewife that would make you bond immediately were maids, diets, exercise, and children. The women in Safayatas were experts on each. "You can afford it. Your hours are so flexible," said Sarita, who had always been the plump one in the group. She looked at Natasha, who protested, saying it was just because of jeans and yoga. Soon it was time for them to say their goodbyes and go home. As she walked to her flat, Aarti couldn't help but think that maybe the only thing she was good at was lying to her friends. Her entire life was a lie. Yes, she pampered her husband, but that was because of the guilt that ate her up. She worked hard, sure, but that was so she could get away from her house. And she laughed merrily because if she didn't, the shame would depress her. If the group ever got to know the truth about her marriage, She knew they would refuse to be her friend anymore. It was a thought that sent shivers down Aarti's spine.